Um, the Columbian Exchange did provide ways for communication, migration, trade, disease, transfer of plants, animals between colonial power and America. So when you think about the AP exam, think about the trends and what happened along with the trade of slavery, which is obviously the biggest point of the Columbian Exchange. But I want you to think about, like, all the other stuff that came along with it, the transfer of information, of agriculture, and how much the Columbian Exchange really changed the manner in which the Americas is set up. So Africa, Americas received pain, disease. Euros got creative ways of thinking, and the scientific revolution kind of happened from that. So what I want you to think about when we say that, the scientific revolution happened and it's a direct result, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that because of this cultural exchange and these ideas, these kinds of things start to ignite, and you start to see really fast switches, right? When you throw two cultures together and they start to really and one culture can really think about what is being added to them, you start to see changes in ideas. So let's get to where we compare colonial societies a little bit. First and foremost, I have to tell you a little bit about mercantilism. Water first. Mercantilism. All right, I know. So my high school teacher, he was a really great guy, but he would go row to row and he'd be like, mercantilism, and then expect that row to know what mercantilism was. And so I remember in high school thinking, oh my gosh, mercantilism, right? But I'll tell you basically kind of a synopsis of what it is. You'll learn more about it when you get into economics, and hopefully you do know about it. But it's basically that the world has a finite amount of resources, and your country's power is dictated by how much of those resources you go out and get. And so this is kind of what the idea that led to the growth of colonialism, the growth of imperialism, and kind of the idea that you need to get as much stuff as possible. So, for example, Cortez, he would ask for light-skinned women, corn, chicken, eggs, tortilla, those type of raw goods, right? Well, except for the women, I wouldn't say that's raw goods. That's just kind of an add-on to slavery. And so that was kind of taking place. Just kind of continuing on Aztec women and the elite status. What I would say is that there was a distinct difference between the way some of the Aztec women were treated compared to others. Some were married off. Usually the light-skinned, more beautiful women were married off to wealthier landowners, and so they saw an upward movement in their status. Okay, but that was not the case for most of them. A lot of them were forced to perform sexual acts. They were forced into a kind of servitude where they would serve, the doña of the region. Large cities, and so basically, it's still kind of that idea that large cities lead to more of an organized society and the quicker way that the Spain kind of grew in the Americas, right? It took the United States, or I should say it took colonial North America a lot longer to expand because of the lack of people. Okay, so when you talk about the Spanish economy and what drove them there, you're talking a lot about gold, silver, maize, commercial agriculture, that kind of thing is really what drew Spain to the Americas. Economically, what ended up kind of happening in Spain is they came up with this encomienda, all right? Encomienda, there you go. It is, in which the Spain had this kind of treaty that was like forced labor for the indigenous people, or the mestizos, those that did end up having relations with the Spanish and had sons and daughters either within wedlock or without of wedlock, forced or unforced. It still created this mestizo race, which we now kind of consider the Mexican race, but it was mestizo in that it was mixed. And because of that earlier mixture, the racial hierarchy is a lot different than what you see in North America. In North America, the women, right? The women came in from England with their husbands, and they went to the colonies together. This forced a division within the slaves that were brought in. So there wasn't as much commingling out in the open. Yeah, it happened behind closed doors, of course. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, right? And so what we would talk about, though, is that in the Latin American countries, there was this commingling, this mestizo races, or excuse me, mestizo action that was taking place throughout, central, I would say, Mexico down all the way to the end of Brazil. And so you saw it kind of changed the way races are looked at within those regions. So a great question for you, and one that I would expect you to answer, is something along the lines of, to what extent did the English women colonizing with their husbands affect racial tensions within North American culture moving forward? So think about that. Read the book. There is no substitute for reading. Read the book, come up with some ideas, and we will talk about it. So few led to the use of. Okay, so typically it was the men that married the women. It was not the other way around. There were very few Spanish women within their colonies, and so you didn't see a lot of commingling in the opposite direction. It was mostly men, soldiers, dons of the land, people that own the land, that kind of thing, that kind of took over. An example given of women improving themselves was this one woman named Mencia Perez. She had 2 different husbands that were wealthy businessmen, and so she saw this upward status happen within her life to where she was the landowner and was controlling these people. Indians were always, or I should say Native Americans were always at the bottom of the system. Courts, women could not be considered. They were considered minors. Native American women were considered minors, and so they had no real jurisdiction when it comes to divorce, marriage, and those kind of things. So let's talk about Brazil, right? That's where this song that I came out to got in my head. I was on Friday, I was thinking about this video, and then my daughter throws this song on in the morning, and why don't we come to Brazil? And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what they were thinking, If you're in Europe and it's cold, if you're in Northern Europe, England, Portugal is pretty beautiful, and I know Brazil was a part of the Portuguese Empire, but why wouldn't you want to go to Brazil or the Caribbean, those kind of things, or the South, if you want to try to get away from the cold weather and stuff like that? Okay, so the Caribbean did not have the same workforce as in Spanish-ruled the Americas. And so what was needed was this influx of slavery. You needed to bring more and more slaves. The problem with it was one of the premier commercial agricultural products was sugar. Sugar is extremely hard to make. Okay, you have to boil it down. It takes a lot of heat. It's extremely dangerous. It's already hot in a lot of those regions in the Caribbean and Brazil. It's already hot and humid. You throw extreme temperatures of a cauldron in there, and it forced a lot of turnover when it comes to the slaves. A lot of the slaves died working. And so this is where that Columbian exchange really started to ramp up as they needed more and more labor. Okay, and so at first the Portuguese did corner the market on the sugar. They learned the refinement practices from Arab nations within the Middle East, and they kind of took that practice and then perfected it and put it to use in the colonies, where they would have this refined raw sugar and then be sending it back to Europe as a form of wealth. So the conditions, heat and fire, good. Women were treated the same as men. They were forced to work just as hard as men on these sugar plantations, where in the more urban areas, you saw the women start to really work under the man of the house, right? The woman of the house. Okay, slave use spread from Brazil into North America plantations. Women women traveled, so there was less racial mixing. Okay, so that's what I was talking about earlier, along with the English bringing in their wives. So you saw less racial mixing, which ended up, I don't know. We'll talk about that later, right? So Europeans' ideals, they did persist in Brazil. We had this European ideal of preserving the bloodline, right? Preserving your ethnicity. However, it was not followed as closely in places like Brazil and the Caribbean as to making sure. Now, if you were lighter skinned, you were treated better than if you had darker skin. That is very true. But what they didn't do is that for example, in North America, if you had any African blood in your family history, you were considered black, right? Which then you would be persecuted for. Unjust and everything. But in Brazil, you were not defined as black unless you were strictly from Africa. So if you were a mestizo, you were just considered a minority. And so what you saw was more and more power for those mestizo races. The thankful thing with our generation is hopefully that we are going to intermix enough to where who cares what race you are anymore, right? All others considered dark skin, right? They were just considered like kind of a minority. And so in Brazil, you would actually see dark skinned mayors and dark skinned officials.